So conductor has one arch enemy to fight: routine. There's no denying that in daily life it has its advantages, but that it plays the most deadly role in music.
He must have known deep unhappiness and happiness as he revealed it in his music making.
His movements, though, were unconventional in that he wasn't apparently trying to keep the orchestra together or to achieve precision. His hands moved in a most strange way.
Furtwängler was almost the only conductor I knew who was totally without vanity, absolutely without conceit. His personality, inasmuch as it came in, and it came in much, was always wholly subservient to what he felt the composer wanted.
He considered himself already a hero, almost, let's say, a member of the resistance, because he had refused to conduct at Hitler's birthday for medical reasons, not for political. This shows you, how naive he was.
Wilhelm Furtwängler, a man whose life became surrounded by controversy, accused of Nazi sympathies, described by Toscanini as an amateur of genius, by Hindemith as a truly great musician and human being, by Hitler as one of the most unpleasant types I know, and by Schoenberg as a better musician than all those Toscaninis, Ormondys, Kusevitskis, and the rest of them. He was a good pianist who wanted to be a composer, but became, almost unwillingly, one of the greatest conductors of all time. This is Tanneck on the Tegernsee, the Bavarian lake where Wilhelm Furtwängler spent much of his youth. His father, Adolf Furtwängler, had discovered the peninsula on a cycling trip. He bought the land, and in 1899, helped by a carpenter, he built a log cabin, which remains the nucleus of Tanneck. Adolf Furtwängler was one of the leading archaeologists of his day. He was director of several museums in Munich, professor at the university, and author of a number of standard works. He also had a great love of music. Wilhelm's mother, Adelheid Furtwängler, was a painter who was regarded as the best copyist in Munich. Adelheid's grandfather had been a collector of folk songs and was a friend of Mendelssohn, while her father, a grammar school headmaster like Adolf's father, had been a friend of Brahms. Wilhelm Furtwängler, the eldest son, was born in 1886 in Berlin. At first he showed an interest in painting, but his musical gifts became increasingly apparent. So at the age of 8, his father took him away from school, and the rest of his education was at the hands of tutors. He never gained any formal qualifications. His tutors in musical theory, counterpoint and composition were Anton Beer-Wallbrunn and Josef Reinberger. His academic tutors were pupils of his fathers, Walter Rietzler and Ludwig Curtius. Wilhelm had started to compose at the age of 7½, and he worked indefatigably, producing lieder, sonatas, chamber music, choral and orchestral works. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was going to be a composer. But he took almost as much interest in walks in the country and all kinds of sporting games. These are his brother and sisters, Walter, Marit, and Annelie. The father gave his two boys a sailing boat, the first to appear on the Tegensee. After Fridtjof Nansen, the polar explorer, had been to Tannek and had talked about his expeditions, Furtwängler Sr. immediately sent to Norway for skis. Wilhelm and Walter were among the first skiers in the Bavarian Alps. It was with skis that Walter later became the first to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in winter. When Wilhelm was 13, he struck up a friendship with Bertele Hildebrandt, the musically gifted youngest daughter of Adolf von Hildebrandt, the sculptor.
He was fully grown, very tall and slender, with wild curly hair, very heavy eyebrows above his fiery, beautiful, expressive eyes, very supple and lithe. He was precociously clever and gave the impression of an immensely gifted personality. There was a sense of victory about him and something solitary. He said, characteristically, "When I have no reason to be happy, then I am unhappy."
In 1901, Wilhelm accompanied his father to Greece, to the island of Aegina, where Adolf Furtwängler had done some of his most important archaeological work.
During the whole of the journey, however, he was not really free, preoccupied more with his inner life than with the exterior world. Goethe's poems and the letters in his pocket, dissatisfied with himself. He has Beethoven's quartets with him and reads them. The style of the later quartets, the fugue especially, is always present in his mind as an ideal.
The letters in his pocket were those of Bertele Hildebrandt, and he was writing to her every day.
This is really a landscape of singular beauty. The very simple lines, as well as the colors, so strong and powerful. The sea as blue as the bluest sky. And yesterday on the boat, when I saw it for the first time, I felt I could embrace a whole world. I know that I must become an extraordinary composer, and that I have it in me to write very beautiful things. But if I do not have sufficient energy and cannot achieve what I know I must achieve, then I know I shall be among the unhappiest of human beings. Aegina here is really the most beautiful place I've found during the whole of this trip. The mountains are rocky and bare, with only a few scattered pine trees which look splendid with their bright pale green leaves, almost bright yellow. There are also lots of olive trees in the valleys, and fig trees and vineyards. Just now the sun is coming out from among the clouds, and the wind is rustling gloriously in the pine trees above me. Oh, it's so wonderfully lonely, and I only wish that you were here too. I also long for music very much. I live like a lonely shepherd here. I climb up through shrubs and rocks, and then I sit down to play my flute as Damon did, but only in my mind, alas. And no one comes along softly through the forest to whom I could play it, so that I remain lonely, and I am sad.
In 1902, Wilhelm went to Florence with Ludwig Curtius. Adolf von Hildebrandt had a house there, where Curtius also taught. Wilhelm entered a world in which the arts were not just looked at, they were lived. In this environment, Michelangelo and Goethe, Beethoven and Kleist took on a new meaning for the 16-year-old boy. They became models, ideals. He was composing in a frenzy. Curtius remembers one event in particular from that stay in Italy.
On one occasion, we went to the Medici chapel together, having agreed not to talk in the presence of Michelangelo's figures. Willie suddenly disappeared, and I got worried. Eventually, I discovered him behind the altar, crouching on the floor, earnestly scribbling notes, the beginnings of the Te Deum.
Eight years later, in 1910, the Te Deum had its first performance at Breslau. Furtwängler himself conducted it the following year in Strasbourg, but it was not heard at the Berlin Philharmonic Hall until 1967, under Haus Chemin Petit. This portrait by his mother shows Wilhelm at the age of 20, when he'd had his first chance to conduct a full-scale orchestra. The program consisted of an adagio by himself and Bruckner's Ninth Symphony. His own composition met with little success, but there were many who realized the talent of the inexperienced young conductor. The next stages were positions as assistant conductor or chorus master in Zurich, Munich and Strasbourg, where he was the third conductor under Hans Pfitzner, conducting repertory operas. In Lübeck, he was appointed concert conductor from among 97 applicants. A music lover, Lily Diekmann, recalls,
"There is in him an inspiring power which has an impact equally on the orchestra and on the audience. True, his physical manner is still indescribably funny. He moves his arms about like a windmill and makes the most atrocious grimaces. His legs, too, have their special movements, so that the whole figure appears to be in an incredible turmoil. But you forget and forgive everything because of what is provided for the ear."
In the spring of 1915, Furtwängler was appointed opera conductor at Mannheim. In 1922, at the age of 36, he succeeded Arthur Nikisch at the Leipzig Gewandhaus and at the Berlin Philharmonic, the most important orchestra in Germany. It had been formed in 1884 by 54 musicians who had pledged their inseparable mutual loyalty. A democratic artists' republic in Imperial Germany. Hans von Bülow had given the orchestra personality, discipline, precision. Nikisch, flexibility, color, a sonorous melodic beauty. Furtwängler combined these elements and produced a symphonic style that has endured.
Nowadays, people are apt to prize a clean and accurate reproduction of what's written in the score above everything else. Can one do justice in a line drawing to a work whose significance lies in its vision of color? The duty of the performer is to go back continually to the style of the work itself and base himself on that. The stronger the structure of a work is, and the greater a composer's mastery of form, the more clearly defined is the interpreter's task. It's only when he has studied and mastered the details that his real task begins, the weaving of all the particular into an organic whole. There's only one correct conception of a Beethoven symphony, so one can only hope to approximate to it.
Yehudi Menuhin first performed with Furtwängler in 1947.
This most beautiful of places in violin literature will remain forever associated, for me, with Wilhelm Furtwängler. He knew how to create magic. Of course, the magic is already in the music, but the interpreter, fortunately, has a great part to play before that music becomes communicable to the world. It is something that will never leave me, this memory of playing this concerto and a few others with him, unfortunately not all the others, because he could recreate, because his mind and his spirit were not only bordered, as it were, by the score. They brought a whole world to the score.
He kept most of his original creativeness within his capacity for interpretation, for re-creation.
It is about his interpretations and his style of conducting that one of the two main controversies about Furtwängler revolved. Hans Keller, musician and writer.
He has been criticized for imprecision. The criticism is justified, but the evaluation isn't. Which is to say that where Furtwängler was imprecise, he not only wanted to be, but the composer wanted him to be. Let me give you one example. First, a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony under Toscanini. I wasn't there myself, but I gather that as soon as the introductory bars, Furtwängler, who was there, jumped up from his seat, shouted bloody time beater, and left the concert hall. What had happened, what had aroused him so, was that Toscanini took the opening sextuplets very precisely, so that you could hear them as sextuplets. Now comes the other part of the story, and that is Furtwängler's own performance of the opening of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. There you couldn't hear a thing. You certainly couldn't hear sextuplets. What you could hear was a vague, tense noise. The beginning before the beginning, as it were, which is exactly what Beethoven had intended it to be.
Furtwängler's tempi also often aroused disagreement.
It's generally said that Furtwängler took very slow tempi. This is really what you mean. Well, sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. Quite often he took far faster tempi than other people. Well, that is so fast a tempo that if you put it in the abstract to anybody, if you asked any musician whether the movement was possible at this speed, he would say no. And that would include myself before I had heard the Furtwängler performance, which, however, only goes to show that tempo in itself is nothing. Tempo is a function of structure, and hence in performance a function of phrasing. You can't decide on a tempo before A, you have experienced the structure, and if you are a listener, before you have experienced the phrasing of the interpreter in question.
Furtwängler himself answered his critics in relation to his performances of Beethoven.
I should not take these tempi if I were not convinced that they were the tempi of Beethoven. The long and the short of it is that an interpreter can render only what he has first lived through. A formula for the correct rendering of everything, no, there isn't such a thing.
Furtwängler also frequently included in his symphonic programs works which he conducted from the piano.
When one thinks of such things as the cadenza in Brandenburg 5, well, never again, I think, will we hear this being composed as it is when he plays it.
Why should classical style be synonymous with boredom? It is untrue to say that Bach has less soul than Puccini. In the case of one, the soul is exposed. In the case of the other, it is within.
You may know Robert Schumann's reaction to the then current opinion that Schubert's longer works were of heavenly length. Schumann argued they were not of heavenly length, they were of heavenly length. I think Schumann would have called Furtwängler's tempi heavenly slow.
The years 1922 to 1933 were perhaps the happiest of his career as a conductor. The Philharmonic concerts had an impact far beyond Berlin, far beyond Germany. Foreign tours took on an unprecedented scope and importance. There were visits to England, Switzerland, Holland, Austria, Italy, Scandinavia, France. At the beginning of this period, in 1923, Furtwängler married a Danish woman, Zietla Lund. Women had always played a part in his life, even though his private existence appeared to take second place to his professional life as a musician. Jascha Horenstein was Furtwängler's assistant for the Frankfurt Music Festival in 1927.
But he was like a lion in a cage, a hungry lion in a cage, on an evening when he was not conducting. This may be the reason that you would say that private life did not exist for him, only his professional life, because he was really, he could not stand one day without having worked, having rehearsed or conducted. This may be the reason that he gave the impression that there was no private life for him. But this was not so. Private life was still very important for him, maybe too important in some period of his life.
In 1927, Furtwängler was appointed permanent conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, a post he held for 3 years, although he always kept a close artistic contact with the orchestra. Many honors came his way, including an honorary doctorate from Heidelberg and the German equivalent of the Order of Merit. He'd already conducted twice in the United States. By his early 40s, Furtwängler had achieved world fame. When the existence of Bayreuth seemed threatened after the death of Siegfried Wagner, it was Furtwängler who was called in. He didn't shrink from this challenge, despite many doubts, and he kept returning to the festival town right up to the end of his life. But this period of achievement and success was interrupted in 1933 by events which had repercussions throughout the musical life of Germany and plunged Furtwängler into the second major controversy of his life, one which to this day still scars his reputation. On January the 30th, the Third Reich was proclaimed. Hitler had come to power.
Es ist unser Wunsch und Wille, dass dieser Staat und dieses Reich bestehen sollen in den kommenden Jahrtausenden. Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
Furtwängler was now Germany's foremost conductor, and it seemed to him inconceivable that his position in the world of art could be undermined by political events. But the impact of the new regime soon made itself felt. Besides the musicians who were forced to leave, others left because they couldn't bear to stay. Increasing attempts were made to interfere with musical activities, and in particular to use the Berlin Philharmonic and Furtwängler as a respectable front to the Nazi regime.
auspicious consequences he had foreseen, incidentally, but consequences which, when they came, in spite of his having foreseen them, were pretty painful to him. Consequences which covered both the human field, i.e. his regard for people who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and the artistic field, inasmuch as he couldn't always do what he wanted to do, and certainly quite often refused to do what he was told to do.
And he was terribly upset about the situation. But how should I say, his being upset was in a wrong direction. He was upset that a man like Bruno Walter could not conduct, was prevented from conducting, that a man like Arthur Schnabel, the great pianist, that a man like Bronislaw Huberman, and he would have done everything in his power to revoke those laws concerning those people, but not concerning a small, modest piano teacher in a conservatory or a violinist in a provincial orchestra.
Jascha Horenstein himself was dismissed as musical director of the Düsseldorf Opera by the Nazis in 1933.
I would like to say very emphatically that Furtwängler was not a Nazi. I have seen him in Vienna in May 1933, it means about 2 months after the Nazis took over. I saw him later in Paris, maybe 1 or 2 years later, and he definitely was not a Nazi. He used very strong language in a conversation with me in Vienna, very strong language against the regime. In saying so, I also would like to stress that it does not mean that I agree with his line of conduct. That is a different matter. He was a great musician, but he was a weak man.
I have often been asked why I remained in Germany at all, when I did not really have to. I could have emigrated at the time and been thought of as a martyr, and fought National Socialism from outside Germany. But I remained. Not because I had changed my views. I offered resistance where it was possible. I did not conduct in occupied countries, because I did not wish to appear in the wake of tanks and guns. My view was and is that art must have no truck with power politics, war and hatred between nations.
In fact, a major difference of opinion arose between Furtwängler and the Nazis in November 1934, when he wrote an article for a German Sunday paper in support of Paul Hindemith, whose compositions had been banned in Germany. This caused a great uproar, and as a result, Furtwängler resigned all his appointments and left Berlin for the Bavarian mountains, where at last he was able to take up composition again. But in spite of the Nazi acts of oppression and suppression, he couldn't stay away from Berlin and its musical life. And within months, he'd made an agreement to acknowledge Hitler and his ministers as solely responsible for cultural policies, in exchange for an assurance that he himself would be free to follow his own musical policies and be independent of politics. This was the only way Furtwängler could continue conducting in Germany. But there were wide disagreements about his decision, and many who thought him a traitor. In the event, it proved not possible to remain independent of politics. In spite of his many acts of resistance to the regime, he was frequently used for propaganda purposes. And in 1942, he was maneuvered into conducting for Hitler's birthday concert. But meanwhile, in March 1937, his first violin sonata had been given its first performance. And later in the same year, the symphonic piano concerto was first heard, with Edwin Fischer as soloist. This rarely heard work was performed in 1965 in Berlin's new Philharmonic Hall by Zubin Mehta, with Daniel Barenboim as soloist.
even though he had great knowledge of music and of how music should be played, there was always an element of improvisation, an element of surprise in the harmonies and in everything that had to do with the music. And it was this kind of conscious naivety that allowed him to understand the music of Beethoven and Brahms and Bruckner and so on so well. And I think this is also what comes through very much in his music. I'll play now a few bars from the cadenza at the end of the first movement.
With the war, concert life in all cities suffered from air raids and travel difficulties. It was a period of concern about the continued existence of the orchestra. Many of its younger members were called up. It was also a period of makeshift halls, of blackouts and air raids, of interrupted performances, of concerts for the wounded and for the workers.
At first I was able to go on working, but gradually difficulties were piling up. I was able, it is true, to remain unaffected in my private sphere. My orchestra too remained intact and kept its full strength at first. But I could not prevent an inexorable change taking place in the musical life. More and more obstacles were being put in my way.
But the more outrageously the Nazis behaved, the more outspoken were Furtwängler's public comments. And in February 1945, he was warned that he was about to be arrested. But he escaped just in time to Switzerland with his son and his second wife, Frau Elisabeth Furtwängler.
In 1945, we lived in Clarens on the Lake of Geneva without money. but Swiss music lovers helped us till 1947. In one way, it was a hard time because we had no news from our family in Germany, or only bad news. But on the other hand, for Furtwängler, it was a big chance. For once he had time for his compositions. So he finished his first symphony, and on the other hand, he adored the mountains and the lake, and it was a big consolation for him to walk in the nature.
In December 1946, 18 months after the end of the war, proceedings took place in Berlin to clear Furtwängler of charges of having supported the Nazi regime. The courtroom was crowded with press photographers, cameramen, journalists. At the second hearing, he was cleared, but months passed before the findings were confirmed by the Allied authorities. Among those who spoke up for Furtwängler was Boleslav Barloch, who's well known as director of the Berlin Schiller Theater.
Ich schrieb damals für eine Berliner Zeitung.
I wrote in a Berlin newspaper at the time, it should be stated here that Furtwängler was one of the few great German artists whose open and vigorous resistance to the Nazis had come to my knowledge. Have those who now criticize Furtwängler never heard of the fact that as late as 1935 he conducted Mendelssohn in public in Berlin? That he rejected presents from Hitler in the shape of an annual pension of 100,000 marks, of a house and a baronial estate? That he refused to give the Hitler salute?
Furtwängler hing an Berlin.
Furtwängler was attached to Berlin, attached to Germany, attached to his Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. He thought he'd be able to do much more to keep the anti-civilization of the Nazi period from prevailing completely in Germany.
In May 1947, Furtwängler made his first appearance in Berlin as a conductor after a gap of over 2 years. Berliners queued up for tickets all night long. The lady at the box office of the Titania Palace received some very strange and rather touching offers. There were those who brought Meissen porcelain figures or leather shoes, almost new, because they had no money. Again, others thought that the currency of those days, cigarettes, might secure tickets even after the stickers saying "House Full" were up. From Whitsun 1947, Furtwängler began to conduct regularly in Berlin, and soon the Berlin Philharmonic was able to go on tour again. At a time when Germany possessed neither respect nor diplomatic missions abroad, Furtwängler and the orchestra became ambassadors of music. Furtwängler was renowned for his interpretations of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Wagner. For the composers of his own day, on the other hand, he appeared to have less sympathy.
It is true to say that he had a certain amount of hostility towards 12-tone music. Hostility which he harbored in spite of the fact that he thought it his duty to give the first performance of Schoenberg's orchestral variations, Opus 31, which are a 12-tone work. He thought this his duty because he smelled that there was great music there, in spite of his hostility to the technique.
One had the impression that he understood and respected the newer works, I am not quite sure whether he loved them wholeheartedly.
He regretted that so great a musician as Schoenberg, the greatest musician he personally had ever come across, could be so far misled by what he thought were Schoenberg's theories as to deny the biological source of music, which to him was key, and do things which could not ever eventually be successful.
The essential thing is what I hear, what comes from the music. A theme, a melodic line, a counterpoint which I cannot perceive clearly and distinctly by the ear alone has no existence for me. My opinion is that the artist's task is a sensualization of the spiritual as much as the spiritualization of sensuality.
As musical life returned to normal, the Berlin Philharmonic appeared in Vienna, Rome, Milan, in Switzerland, Scandinavia, in the festival cities, in Paris, and in London, where Furtwängler conducted Brahms' Fourth Symphony.
When Furtwängler did appear again after the war, this was a very great occasion for most people, certainly for me, and I went.
Gareth Morris performed regularly with Furtwängler in the Philharmonia Orchestra from 1949 to 1954.
He would quite often go on for a long time without stopping. then perhaps he'd stop to rehearse some little moment in the music that he wasn't quite happy about. And never did Furtwängler say, "You're not with me, this will not do, you're not together." He would stop as though he himself wasn't satisfied, and therefore we couldn't be either. This was a duet with Furtwängler. It's quite wrong, I always think, to say an orchestra appears under Mr. So-and-so, the great conductor. When you're playing with a really great conductor, you're not under him, you're with him.
Simon Goldberg was leader of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra under Furtwängler from 1929 to 1934.
I don't know how other orchestras reacted to his ways, but I knew him only as the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. It was, above all, his tremendous seriousness, his honesty, his fanaticism, with which he rehearsed, that impressed the orchestra very much. He did not, or it seemed as if he would not rehearse for a next concert. He just worked in order to come closest to his vision of a particular work.
Vollendete. Nicht die Eins zu betonen bei dem Pizzicata. Ja, es muss alles wie ein Schleier sein, ohne jegliche Betonung. Und die nicht langsam. Und diese Sechstel sofort wirklich fassen. Crescendo ist in der Mitte des Taktes. Nicht schon am Anfang. Sowohl bei Ihnen als auch viel zu früh. Nur ganz, und nicht so übertrieben stark. Das ist ganz das Melancholische. Okay. Machen wir es nochmal. Bitte recht legato. Nicht ja, dann ist wieder einhängen.
Dass eine Präzision erreicht wird, wenn man hart und klar schlägt, ist ja sehr, sehr einfach. Aber zugleich mit diesem harten und klaren Schlag zu verbinden, alle die übrigen Valeurs, die Werte, die man dem Orchester beimischen will und muss, nicht wahr? Entweder einen harten Klang oder einen Weichklang, ein Legato, ein Staccato, Übergänge, all das liegt eben in der Schlagtechnik. Diese Schlagtechnik in diesem Sinne ist der Dirigent selber. Jeder hat eine andere. Das ist das Persönlichste, was es gibt. Genauso wie jeder große Geiger einen anderen Ton hat. Man weiß nicht, wenn er mit dem Kreisler auf einer Geige spielt, auf irgendeiner Holzkiste, dann ist trotzdem plötzlich Kreisler. Ja? Und das ist bei Dirigenten auch so. Der Schlag, wenn er Nikisch hereingeschlagen hat, sofort klang das Orchester vollkommen anders, als bei irgendjemand anders geklang hat. Ja? Bei wirklichen Dirigenten hat jeder seinen Schlag an sich und der Schlag beeinflusst den ganzen Klang.
Besides the Berlin Philharmonic, there were once more concerts and tours with the Vienna Philharmonic and opera performances at the Salzburg Festival. In his last years, his work continued unabated. Long tours, Caracas, Egypt, plans for a tour of the United States with the Philharmonic in 1955. He also still managed to find time to work with other orchestras. In opera, he set new standards, with Wagner in Italy, Weber and Mozart at Salzburg. He conducted Don Giovanni at Salzburg 3 months before he died. The last document. On September the 20th, 1954, he stood on the rostrum of the Berlin Titania Palace for the last time. Beethoven's First and his own Second Symphony were his farewell to the world of concerts. He still did some recordings in Vienna. After that, Furtwängler fell ill with pneumonia and died on November the 30th, 1954. He was buried at Heidelberg. Furtwängler's posthumous Third Symphony in C-sharp minor was first performed in January 1956 by the Berlin Philharmonic under the late Joseph Kalbert. Composed during the difficult period after the war, its 4 movements originally had titles, which Furtwängler later deleted. Only the first 3 movements are completely finished. The first was called Fate, the second, Life, and the third, Beyond. The variety of his activities has kept Furtwängler's impact alive, largely due to his gramophone recordings. Yet he had almost a kind of discophobia, as he didn't want to believe in the potentialities of the medium. Many of his best discs are recordings made during concerts. The archives of broadcasting stations still hold many recordings not available to the public, including a complete cycle of Wagner's Ring.
Many of his so-called mistakes were due to the fact that he risked a lot, as every great artist must. It's the easiest thing in the world always to play well. Only the really bad artists always play well if they've got sufficient technique. Good artists don't. It's also true of composers. Only the really mediocre composers tend to be flawless on their own level. The greatest composers, Mozart perhaps apart, all have their flaws, which stand in direct proportion to the degree to which they are prepared to take risks. Furtwängler was as prepared to take risks as a composer, with the additional disadvantage that he was a performer.